Hello, everyone, and welcome to Optimizing Sponsor CRO Relationships, presented by CRO. I'm Rebecca Williamson, the publisher of Fierce Markets Life Sciences Group, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Kristen Snipes, Project Director at CRO, and Jamie Arnott, also Project Director at CRO. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. Got just a few technical notes for you before we begin. If you have any trouble reading a slide, please hold and drag the right corner of the slide window to enlarge. Please also disable your pop-up blocker to participate in the interactive parts of the presentation. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Download Slides widget at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. And we're going to be following the presentation today with a Q&A session. So please submit your questions during or after the presentation using that Q&A box at the right side of your window. All right, I think that's everything from me. Kristen, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kristen Snipes, and I'm a project director at CRO. I have been in drug development for 18 years now. 13 of those years have been at CRO in various roles in both clinical operations and project management. So if you do the math, that means that I have spent 5 years on the sponsor side as well. And during my experience on the sponsor side, I managed sort of end-to-end for small biotech, everything from being involved in coordinating analytical method development through our work in the clinics. And my focus is in CNS, cardiology, and dental indication.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Arnott, and I've also been in the industry more than 16 years now in clinical research. I started my work in clinical starting with bedside nursing, really focused on oncology. I then transitioned to clinical research, working at both a small CRO as well as small biotech. In my current role in project management, my focus is mostly large full-service phase 3 trials with indications of infectious diseases as well as ENT.
Okay, so today we are going to be talking about optimizing sponsor CRO relationships, and Jamie and I are going to be talking to you about the ideal relationship. A large foundation of creating a good relationship between sponsors and CROs is communication, so we're going to spend a majority of our time talking about communication, what we call the conversation or negotiation, oversight, which is critical to any study, reporting, and financial management as it plays into sponsor-CRO relationships. At the end, we're going to review some case studies and talk about some takeaway keys to success. Okay, so when you think about sponsor-CRO relationships, we kind of think about what are you looking for in a partner for your clinical studies. And based on where you are on the sponsor or the CRO side, it's likely that your answers will vary and also be based on your past experience or even your corporate culture at the company that you're at. And ultimately, what Jamie and I come back to are the same key factors in any sponsor-CRO relationship, which is communication, reports, and those give us visibility into study progression and metrics around how the study is going, financial management and specifically budget management, as well as oversight of the project. And so over the course of the presentation, we're going to review each of these areas and discuss methods for fostering collaborative working relationships. And you'll see at the foundation of all of these is communication.
So the first thing to talk about really is the ideal relationship. So we're going to talk here about good, healthy working relationships. And again, some of this isn't just limited to sponsor-CRO relationships. This is really ideal for any working relationship. Most important and the foundation for all of this is trust. Really building that trust can really help build your relationship. Being accountable for the work that you produce as well as your team's work, being reliable, showing follow-through, as well as being honest and forthcoming even when the conversation is difficult. Mutual respect, as well as welcoming diversity. These two things really recognizing that not everyone is the same, appreciating what each person brings to the table, as well as their individuality. Mindfulness, really the time that this is a key, the timing is key, and you value people's presence, you value their time, and you're mindful that they have other priorities. Open communication. Again, we're going to go back to communication throughout this presentation. Sharing what you think or feel in a clear manner, recognizing that not everyone communicates the same way. And then in business relationships, sometimes a single point of contact can really help streamline projects such as these clinical studies. So really identifying what that is can really get you started on the right foot. So manners, we've all learned our manners, but in business etiquette, sometimes it's helpful to review these again as you're building a new relationship. So as we go through these, really being present, avoiding other distractions, being on time, whether this is to a conference call or to a face-to-face meeting. Being punctual shows the other people that you value their time. Along with that is being responsive and reliable, being timely with your responses and follow through. When you're committed to returning a response or an answer to a question, you need to make sure that it happens in the time that you expect. Your use of technology. Evaluate what is required for the question that's asked. For example, if you have a short message, let's say you just want to share some brief information or you're requesting something, that may be simple to use email. However, if you have something that requires brainstorming, perhaps a lengthy discussion is more sensitive or actually potentially negative in nature, you may want to schedule a phone call or have a more formal meeting. By doing this and sending your email in carefully written manner, you're going to say to someone that their relationship matters and what you have to say is important and that you're going to take the time to write this note. Your business writing should avoid negative or unprofessional comments. Again, emojis are great. I love them, but again, not in a work setting. Choosing your words wisely. Make sure that it's conveying the message you want it to say. And of course, double checking for spelling or grammar issues, as well as that your recipients are the intended people that you plan to send the email to. The final two really also are particularly important in person when you're having a face-to-face meeting. We all have smartphones, and they're really handy, but they're also extremely distracting. So the tendency to want to pick them up and look and check for texts is there. So when you have a face-to-face meeting, turning your phone off or leaving it at your desk, really showing the person that you're paying attention to them and that they're important. In addition, your body language during a meeting is really key. The way you sit, the way you interact, the eye contact you make says a lot about your interest and the value that you put in the relationship. Again, making the effort to truly listen and be an active listener in the meeting is key. So let's talk about the needs. In this relationship, we all have things that we need. So we'll start on the sponsor side. What does the sponsor need? Well, from the sponsor's perspective, the key to a good relationship starts with the following items. Clear communication pathways. Who do I reach out for what questions? This really helps them understand where they go for what answers and who to go to. Points of escalation. We all hope that our studies will go off without a hitch, but we recognize that there may be times where we want to reach out to someone if the primary contact is out of the office. We want to know who to reach out to, who to go to with concerns. This ensures that everyone is in the loop. Timelines and risk identification. This is really part of really ensuring that the scope of work is covered, that the needs of the sponsor are identified, and that it's possible that the person who negotiated that work originally isn't the current primary contact. So really identifying these things, outlining them initially will really help bolster this relationship. Confirming the key staff members, the sponsor really needs this from the CRO. They need to know who they have and who's going to be working on their team. They want to be sure that the CRO has a clear strategy for staffing, even if that staffing has to change midstream. They want that visibility. They want it to be transparent. If something should change, they want to know that they can count on the CRO to give that information to them without hiding behind some issues. In addition, sponsors likely need information for upward reporting. They need they have their own internal pressures, whether it's for financing, perhaps they have additional stakeholders that they've got to report to. So recognize that this has an important need and that they've got other people to report to in addition to their senior management. Recognizing this study is also a reflection on the sponsor themselves, you really want to be attentive to the fact that your performance also reflects on the sponsor themselves. So again, some of these things overlap to the CRO side, but the CRO has its own list of needs as well. Some of these include the following. Clear directives, getting a unified message, understanding if there are multiple people at the sponsor side, making sure that they have a clear message unified together that they share with the CRO. so that they know what the key decisions are, what are the critical dates, as well as the key milestones for the study. The sponsors themselves really need to make sure that they've had their own internal meetings when there's some conflict or hot topic they need to review before bringing that to the table for the CRO. The CRO wants to have a clear direction in order to know where to go. Again, same thing, a point of contact is really helpful to have that single point of contact. Occasionally, there may be a single point of contact, but a decision maker may be slightly different. So knowing that that may be different. Identifying who those stakeholders are, who those decision makers may be. And very key, but often forgotten, is whose SOPs are we following? It may seem obvious, and it should be clear, but it can occasionally be overlooked, and this can cause rework, retraining, and downstream impact that could have been avoided. So communication, again, this is one of those things, we all have our own styles, we all have our own preferences, and they may change throughout the timing of the study, whether it's phone, fax, email, or even smoke signal. We have to find out what the preference is for the person in the other side of this relationship. And we've got to be able to adjust, even if it doesn't always match our own. We can always reevaluate and adjust based on how that works. In addition, language differences sometimes may impact what method works best. It may be that you prefer phone calls, but if the other person, English is not their primary language, you may find that following up with a clear email may be more beneficial. In addition, if you need a response to a question and you sent it via email, but they're in a different time zone, recognize that your response may not be provided in the format or the timing that you would expect. As I mentioned, the frequency may vary at a given stage of the project. So again, perhaps during startup, you may need to have more frequent contact and communication, whereas as you go along and the study is actively enrolling, it may require less interaction.
So negotiation is something that we do every day. We negotiate on matters big and small. We negotiate internally with each other as a part of our project teams. We also negotiate externally between sponsors and CROs. And there are two different types of negotiation. There's position-based negotiation where you're focusing on your goal of what you want, and then there's interest-based negotiation. And interest-based negotiation is really the best way to optimize your working relationship. When it's done correctly, it can build trust and rapport. And interest-based negotiation focuses on the why. And so in order to prepare for negotiation with your colleagues, what you need to do is prepare appropriately for the discussion or for the conversation. And to do that, you need to think about some of the things that Jamie highlighted as we move through the ideal relationship and communication. Consider the communication styles of the people that you're working with. And don't assume that your communication style is going to fit the conversation. Before you go into the discussion, you want to make sure you define what your outcome is. What do you want from the negotiation? Also consider from the opposite side what the likely desired outcome of your colleague is. You also want to consider what they are saying they want versus what they really actually want or need. And then you want to identify some of those things that Jamie talked about. What are their drivers? What is the underlying interest of those involved in this discussion coming to the table? You should know and have an understanding of sort of where the end goal for your clients are. And so you want to make sure that you're using that to inform your decisions in the discussion. You also want to make sure that you're not making any assumptions, so consider the fact that you may not have all the pieces of the puzzle and be prepared for that as well. Create a list of the interests of those involved, including yourself, and also prioritize those in preparation for the negotiation. So an interest-based approach for negotiation, you need to identify interests. And so how you do that is through understanding of perspective. And the best way to understand the perspective is to listen. And so you can see that repeated here. Think about what is important, what interest do the stakeholders have? Listen to what they are saying. Ask open-ended questions like why and how, and listen to their response. Don't jump in or be quick to speak over, but truly listen and consider their perspective. And think about what interests you can find common ground with, but also any issues or interests that you see that might stand in the way of you coming to agreement as you think about your desired goal. So what are some of these open-ended questions that you can ask? Why is this important to you? Or what is important to you about that? And a good example of this is a lot of times at the end of the study, or as we're coming up on important milestones, we have a need to get a CSR done 2 weeks earlier. So we need to understand, what are the drivers for this? Is this a true need or is it a want? And so this is an easy example of where you can ask open-ended questions to negotiate around this request to determine what is the best need for the client and for each of the teams in order to meet that. So as Jamie highlighted, at this point, we're going to go through the negotiation conversation and how it will flow. And given your working relationship with the foundation that you've established along the way, you've established your rapport, and you've created a comfortable environment for the discussion. You have built trust. One of the key things to remember that we talk about is it's okay to say no. As you move through the conversation, saying yes in order to come to agreement is not always the best path. And honesty and transparency are the best policy. So if the request isn't realistic and you can't meet the need, you don't want to agree to something and then not be able to deliver on it. So you've established the rapport and you've set the environment to facilitate the discussion. And the next step is to move into reviewing the issue. And what you want to do is to state your understanding of the situation so that it's clear on both sides what the issue for discussion is. And then to ask open-ended questions once you've gained consensus that your statement of the problem is correct. You want to start with general questions so that you can find some common interest and common ground to build on. And then as you move through, the key here is to demonstrate your understanding of the interests of the others. So people want to feel heard and they want to feel understood. And so as you discuss the situation, make sure you are confirming that you understand their perspective, you understand their needs, and you understand why things are of importance to them. The next would be to propose solutions. If you've prepared for the negotiation, then you should have potential solutions and outcomes that you have prepared. Suggest these solutions that address the key interests that you've heard. Be clear about what the options are, but also be open to discussion. They will come with ideas as well, and so you want to make sure that you remain open and think about and truly process their ideas. Again, people want to be heard. At the same time, you do want to advocate in your interests while listening. So hopefully, ideally, during the conversation, you can establish agreement. And this means that you can identify a general solution that all parties can agree on. And you can discuss specific actions to follow. And hopefully, you can establish some goals. And we like to ensure our goals are SMART, which means specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and then the time frame for which we are going to execute on them. Again, remember that it may be that you're not able to get to this stage. It's okay to end the conversation if you need more time to review options or discuss them with the team, then you need to say so. Committing to something without having done your homework will lead to not being able to meet a goal and then frustration, and you will lose trust and the relationship will begin to falter. So when you cannot agree, it is okay to say no. If you are able to come to agreement, before you wrap up your call, you'll want to make sure that you confirm that commitment by defining and assigning responsible individuals for each of the actions. And you'll also want to agree on how you're going to monitor that progress, or if it's something that needs follow-up, and then you'll want to evaluate and put into place parameters for that as well. And then following the conversation, you'll highlight, as you wrap up, just some of the successes, the commonalities that you had, and wrap up the call. So that was the ideal situation, but again, things don't always go as smoothly as we would like, and there are times when things go wrong. And so there are going to be a lot of times where you aren't going to be able to come to an agreement. And that could be because you need to get more information from your team before committing, or it may be that you just don't have enough information at this time in general from what they're requesting. So what you need to do is go back and ask more open-ended questions. Go back to find some common ground, circle back to your team, and come up with additional solutions, and then restart the conversation. If the conversation seems stuck during your negotiation and while the conversation is ongoing and you seem to be in a circular discussion, then you can ask the other person for their assessment of how the conversation is going. Allow them to kind of provide their input on how they feel the conversation is, and potentially suggest continuing it at another time. If the conversation becomes heated, this is a time when you may want to pause and consider tabling it for a later time. When people become very passionate about it, they tend to stop sort of listening to one another, and this isn't going to help to foster the relationship or build that trust. So what you need to do is take a breath and consider ending the conversation and asking for it to be rescheduled at a time when everybody can come back gathered.
So these conversations are really universal within business relationships. But ultimately, we need to summarize what are the key takeaways for communication. Most importantly, we want to identify what are our objectives, as well as what are those key interests that we have. Who are the owners and the decision makers within this process? Providing input and feedback to the people involved. We don't always have to agree, but really your input should be considered valuable, particularly if you've built that foundation of a relationship. Offering other options, things that may work differently, and being involved in the study plan and the development of the strategies for the study moving forward will really help foster and continue the relationship. We'll go back to this, as Kristen mentioned as well, really being transparent, not saying yes just because it's the right thing to say, making sure that the answers really meet with your team's needs as well as both sides' team's needs. Being respectful and professional, using those business manners, really following what makes most sense, and continuing to review what you understand that has been communicated. As Kristen mentioned, really reevaluating what was stated. Is it continuing to be the same message, or is it changing based on the needs of the study? So this relationship, we like to think, okay, we're going to partner together, it's going to be 50-50, but the reality is there is a level of oversight that is required by the sponsor. In ICH Consolidated Guideline on Good Clinical Practice, as you know, it states that a sponsor may transfer any or all of the sponsor's trial-related duties and functions to a CRO, but the ultimate responsibility for the quality, integrity of the trial data always resides with the sponsor. So there is this need that the sponsor has to have some oversight. So there's a balance that we do talk about. So it isn't just a handoff of the study and walking away, but it also isn't a micromanaging of the daily activities. So there's some need to tie this into a business relationship and understanding how to document this. One of the ways that we see this oversight is really important is documenting it in project plans. This outlines that oversight as well as the key handoffs. These project plans help set the foundation, and then they can be reevaluated throughout the study as it progresses. The visibility is key here for us to be able to identify what is in these project plans and what the intended steps in terms of oversight. So documentation of this oversight. How will this be demonstrated? What can the sponsor do to show that they've provided this oversight? Well, it's not just a single person issue. It's really a team effort. Again, whether it's an email confirmation of a review of a key document, updates to trackers and tools and deliverables, or documentation of the meeting minutes, key decisions, key risks, as well as discussion topics that were brought up. These are ways that this documentation can be put in place. It's critical that this information gets placed into the trial master file as part of the documentation of this oversight and the study itself.
So reporting is another way to provide visibility, and it is a way that we communicate with each other during the course of the study. And what we want to do at the start of a study is we lay the foundation for expectations and communication is to determine what is needed for this study. What are the sponsor needs for the study? What are the indication specifics that we're looking at for this? What is of importance for this project to be successful in reporting and providing visibility into the activities? There's also the balance of what was standard, what was sort of budgeted for, and what the CRO would normally provide. And at the start of the study, it's key that you review these sort of expectations and assumptions on either side for what you're going to be providing and reviewing, along with the frequency. The other thing to discuss is format. We've seen that some of our clients prefer to get their reports from our study website, to pull them on demand from EDC systems. Others prefer for them to be emailed. So ask the questions and don't make assumptions. Make sure that you're delivering and tailoring your communication and the reporting as needed. The reporting for us is a process. At the start of a study, the metrics that you're going to be reporting on are going to be different as you progress through the execution of the project. So while you may lay the foundation, as Jamie highlighted, in project plans, it's important that you continue to reassess through the progress of the study. So at the onset, we're going to determine our study reporting requirements, and we're going to implement the reporting process. And at start, that is focused on site metrics and study startup. And as we move into the enrollment phase of the project, that's going to focus on accrual reports, data query trends, et cetera. It's important that you periodically review and reevaluate how the reports are working. Are they meeting the needs? And don't assume that just because you haven't heard anything that there aren't any additional needs of your clients. It may be that somebody doesn't feel comfortable asking for any additional. So checking in and, again, showing them that you are listening and value their input provides that additional level of trust and rapport with your clients. Adjust the frequency or the content as you need, and then you're going to implement that revised reporting process. It's also important to make sure that you're evaluating the reports for information that's currently being used. Again, as you move through the study, reports that you started to create and relied on early on are going to taper off. So there's no need to continue to send reports that have information that is stagnant or that is no longer changing. So consider the reports that you're sending and make sure the information is relevant and of use to both your study team and to the sponsor study team. No one enjoys financial management, and money is uncomfortable to discuss in any relationship, and that rule applies for CROs. This is one of my least favorite portions of my job as a project director, but it is a very necessary part. And the same rules apply here for financials as they did with communication and the other items that we talked about. Again, transparency and visibility, we feel, are some of the best ways to ensure a strong working relationship. Also, direct communication. You don't want to wait and try to avoid the discussion until it becomes past the point of painful for both parties. And remember that sponsors do not have unlimited funds and need to account for study budgets. Drug development is expensive, so it's important that as a CRO, we project our costs as accurately as possible and clearly address assumptions as early as possible. So, as I noted, this is just for reference that a recent estimate took a large pharma R&D budget and divided it by drugs approved to give a cost for drug development. And that cost is $11.8 billion per single drug. That's quite expensive. And Forbes puts the success rate of phase 3 trials overall at 50% and the success rate of novel first-in-class products at 25%. So that means that the success rate of phase 3 studies are at about 60% and the success rate of phase 2 are at about 32%. So you can see why budgeting and financial tracking are really critical, and visibility into this on both sides is helpful to building a strong relationship. When you start a study, and as you move through, you definitely want to make sure that you review any assumptions in the study budget. It's important to make sure that as you begin a project, that the critical milestones and any key program drivers are accounted for. And you also want to make sure that any assumptions that you've made on the sponsor or CRO side are outlined and accurate in the study budget. Something as simple as Jamie said as whose SOPs are we following can have considerable budgetary impact on one side or the other. And in addition, it may be that the person who negotiated the study budget on either side was not involved in the contracting process for one reason or another. And so therefore, they're coming to the table with a different set of expectations. So again, laying that foundation, having the discussion up front and addressing any disparities at the start will help to build and foster that relationship. You also want to identify stakeholders in the process for change orders. That may be the same person that you're talking with on a day-to-day basis. It may be a different group. And so you want to make sure that you identify the process, you understand if there's a threshold amount, what you're allowed to move forward with, and what is going to require written approval. Again, transparency and clear communication are key, and notification on both sides as early as possible.
So as Kristen mentioned earlier, we want to talk about a couple case studies. These are things where the relationship meets challenges, and how do you handle those? So the first example is one that we've experienced here, and actually on both sides, so on the CRO side as well as the sponsor side. So you have the project manager is headed out on parental leave. So the change in primary contact is going to occur for the next 6 months. There's a good standing relationship in place between the current project manager at the sponsor and the CRO, but they're headed out, and the interim project manager is assigned. So really, this interim person has no prior experience on the trial, and there's no prior relationship that's been built. So the question is really, how do you develop this trust and manage to fill those shoes of the previous PM? Well, on both sides, regardless of which side has lost their PM, you really want to start interacting with the team in advance of the start of the leave. We recognize that this isn't always possible. So as an active member in these team meetings, it really can help start this relationship off on the right foot. Getting this new interim PM as part of the calls, having them facilitate some of the deliverables if it happens to be on the CRO side, having them being an active participant, assigning action items to this person, even in advance of the actual leave. At the CRO, with the PM change, really going back to the basics of this relationship building, being consistent, being reliable, being responsive, building that trust one step at a time. One of the key things is to really encourage feedback, both directly as well as providing that escalation pathway we talked about earlier. It really ensures that the sponsor feels heard and understood. They haven't quite developed that relationship yet with this interim PM, so it gives them that comfort that you say, please reach out, use this escalation pathway, and they'll know that that's really an opportunity and an avenue for them to utilize. As the relationship continues, this interim PM should continue to ask clarifying questions. Schedule time to meet one-on-one with the sponsor PM to really help facilitate the relationship. Don't make any commitments that this transfer is only going to be interim. Having learned this from experience, oftentimes parental leave can be longer than expected. Build this relationship as though it's going to last forever. It's always possible that they won't return, and you want to make every effort to create and maintain this positive relationship. It will benefit the study as well as the relationship, whether you work on the study for 6 months or 5 years. When the sponsor PM changes, you have to see, a lot of times we've seen this where the new person comes in and they're not clear where the decisions came from. They may want to reverse decisions, or they don't understand the foundation that's been put in place. So some of the tracking tools and reporting requirements may need to change, as well as the actual meeting schedule itself. So what can you do? Well, the CRO PM can certainly plan to schedule additional time to really walk through and review all the study documentation, decisions, and the path that led us to this current status. It really helps to ensure that that sponsor PM feels included, feels recognized, and feels heard.
So in this case, we are awarded a rescue study from a sponsor. And the question here is, how do we manage expectations and build relationships with a client who is coming from a place where they are lacking trust and feeling like they may or may not have had a choice in this change. Rescue studies occur for different reasons. And so what you need to do is to look at and take an inventory of where the study is at. And this is one of these times where you really want to use your communication skills and to ask those open-ended questions. You want to make sure that you review any lessons learned from their relationship with the previous CRO. Understand where things went wrong and what the issues were. A lot of the times when we're handed a rescue study, communication is cited as one of the largest issues, and as well as sort of visibility is that they weren't seeing progress. Now, that may or may not have been true, but they weren't given visibility into that. So at this point, it's likely that your timelines are crunched and your sponsor is frustrated, and you're probably also going to have sites that are frustrated. And so your project team has a lot of work to do to establish good relationships and build rapport on two fronts with both the sponsor and the site. So again, you want to make sure that you are taking a stock of what the internal pressures are for your sponsor and understanding what their new requirements are in order to get the study completed, as well as providing assurances to both the sites and the sponsor that you are able to meet those expectations and to provide visibility into the ongoing project. You want to make sure that in this case, and we see this as critical, that you aren't just saying yes. The sponsor is unhappy and they are likely trying to make up for lost time, but you want to make sure that even if your message isn't a favorable one, that you provide an explanation for your rationale. If they want you to get something done in 3 months that you think is going to take you 5, then you need to be clear about that. And you need to explain your rationale and try to have that negotiation with them so that they understand your rationale and discuss the pros and cons of each approach. The last thing you want to do is to simply say yes and then fall short on meeting their expectations, thus contributing further to their unhappiness and frustration. So the goal here is, as I said, would be to take an inventory of the current situation and to really determine communication paths that will provide that sort of ability for you to build rapport, whether that's a daily check-in with your counterpart so that they can hear about the things that you're doing, or an email every day summarizing the activities to date. It may feel like a lot, but it's going to go a long way to begin to build that trust and to build that relationship and to establish that faith that your team is performing the work and that you guys can get the job done.
One additional case study to talk about is site selection. We've all seen this. You're running a phase 3 study, it's awarded to the CRO, and the sponsor provides a list of sites for the study. The CRO qualifies them, and a number of the sites may not have really passed the muster for the study, but the sponsors continue to elect to use them. Again, you want to value the relationship and you want to move forward with what the sponsor is requesting, but again, going back to we can't always say yes. So really start with those open-ended questions. What can you ask in that time? Understanding what is the driving factors. What is the need for these additional sites, and how will they add to the value of your study? What are the budget implications for adding sites that may not be as highly qualified as some of the other sites that you've selected? What is the impact to your timeline? What is the vision of your team if they've got to use time to activate sites that may not be as qualified? Really use those active listening skills, reviewing the risks for pulling on these sites that may not be as valuable to your study. Anticipate the sponsor's needs, and perhaps, again, going through that list of issues and interests that come along. Things such as they really want to up their timeline, they want to shorten the enrollment period, and how to get there. What can we do to mitigate those strategies to ensure that we get enough sites to ensure enrollment without putting on sites that may not be of high quality? Again, continuing to develop this positive relationship, it requires that you question some of the decisions, that you provide that feedback, that you are an active participant in the relationship, and that you really evaluate and do more extensive feasibility as you're doing the site selection process. A sponsor who hears that you're questioning and you're asking really good questions about the process are going to value that relationship and trust it much more.
So in this case, we have a situation where we have a client who wants to do study startup activities out of order. And this can happen for various reasons. And so in this case, it's about client management. How do you help manage your client to understand the risks and to clearly communicate while not damaging the relationship? So here we have a sponsor who would like to do site initiation visits before even IRB approval is provided. And in this case study, the driver for this was the overall timeline. And as you can, I'm sure as many of you who have done a lot of clinical trials are probably shaking your head on the phone. And what we needed to do as a study team was to provide clear risk to benefit analysis and to discuss with them bringing to the table that interest-based negotiation that we talked about. We needed to really understand the why of this was important. And we needed to have a communication and a conversation around the impact and the risks for moving forward with this strategy. As you can see from this, a lot of the impact to this was going to lead to financial ramifications for them depending on how the study progressed with these sites. So as we had the conversation with our client, we noted that sites that are not IRB approved and further away from activation are likely to have changes to staff. We're also likely to have sites that are going to forget the training provided at the time, and therefore, in order to ensure the sites were up to speed on all of the protocol requirements, we were going to recommend additional retraining to ensure the highest quality of the data. The other concern was that if you train sites too early, you lose that momentum, you lose that focus on your study. And so again, you needed to re-energize the group. For logistics purposes, we also needed to create study plans with a draft protocol, which then can cause additional rework. It could also lead to confusions if we're training sites prior to IRB approval on a draft protocol. So when things happen out of order, the biggest thing to do here is to identify the risks and downstream activities impacted by these choices. And while you cannot control this situation, the communication, the interest-based negotiation becomes key, understanding the why, looking towards the goal, and highlighting any activities impacted. You do need to push back and communicate. Obviously, we have regulations in place that need to be followed, and we do enforce those. But at the end of the day, if the risks are worth the client, if the client is willing to review the risks and take those, then we will support them in that movement forward.
So just to summarize, really the keys that we find to success for maintaining CRO-sponsor relationships. One thing is to really make personal connections. And when I say personal connections, I'm really talking about paying attention to the details. Remembering names. You know, I'll get introduced to someone and almost immediately you'll forget their name. This is really important to take the time, hear their name, understand what their background is, really referencing people by name. And in addition, when in doubt, introduce other people. If you know both people in the room and you're not sure if they know each other, take the time to introduce them. Most people, people really feel valued regardless of their position. They like to know that they're recognized. In addition, with these connections, when someone mentions perhaps, let's say they're traveling out of town or perhaps going to a graduation, if the opportunity arises, ask how their trip was or perhaps how the graduation event occurred. Really figuring out what brings people joy can really help foster this relationship. It really does make a difference. I had a coworker who loves to talk about their pets, and really understanding this and finding some commonality really helps build that relationship foundation. Being an active listener, not just waiting your turn to talk, is key. Understanding the other person's point of view, waiting, and understanding what they have to say is key. Staying informed, this is important whether you're on the sponsor side or the CRO side. Following press releases can really be important because it can guide additional conversations. You may find that there are additional development programs that are competing for your contact's focus. And so recognizing that they have competing demands and that it may make it more challenging for them to be fully present in the relationship or in the calls that you may be having. Again, all of these things, all of these relationship things, the key pieces of cost, quality, and time are critical in the running of a successful clinical study. But again, building that foundation of a positive relationship built on trust with the communication is really key, and that's where we see that this all starts. And if there are any questions, we'll stop there.
Okay, great. Yeah, perfect. Great presentation. Thank you very much. So it's now time to move on to the Q&A session. And just to let our audience know, there's still time to submit questions. Again, use that Q&A box on the right side of your window. But we'll start things off here. This question is for either of you. What types of things have you seen that can adversely affect the relationship?
Sure. So I'll mention one thing, and then I'll give it to Kristen. This is Jamie. So I'll mention that safety, if you get unexpected data, so if you have something where your relationship is humming along and you've really built the foundation of trust, and then there's data that the sponsor is not expecting. They're concerned that there may be something, and that could potentially be a problem. The reality is if you've built that foundation, then hopefully it will maintain it and it will keep it in place. But those are the types of things where if you haven't built that relationship, that it can cause a wrinkle in the relationship.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the other thing, and we touched on this a little bit, is where there's a request made and you're quick to say yes, and maybe you didn't check with your internal project team, or there's a conflict or a resource that you need is out, and you're unable to fulfill that request for some reason. Depending on, if you're new to the relationship, that's going to more adversely impact your working relationship. If, as Jamie pointed out, if you've built up that rapport and that trust, then one instance of that is not going to impact you overall. But the more times that occurs where you agree to a deliverable or agree to a milestone change, and you are not able to meet that goal, that will continue to draw down and impact your relationship, and as they won't be able to count on you.
Okay, very good. Next question for you here. Can you elaborate more on project plans? How are they different from the scope of work?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I can start that. So project plans, the way that we view them here at Rowe is they really they give you the details of how the project will be put in place. So it depends on which plan you're talking about. So whether it's a clinical monitoring plan or project management plan, it outlines the process. It supports our SOPs, and there may be some things that are slightly different from the SOPs, but how will we'll use a clinical monitoring plan as an example. How will those monitoring visits occur? What's their frequency? What type of data we'll be looking at, and what are the important steps in that process?
Yeah, I would just say that the scope of work identifies the roles and responsibilities and gives it a very high level, probably the framework for our project plans, whereas our project management plan, clinical monitoring plan, each of the functional areas have plans that take a deeper dive into the specifics of those functions and provide more granularity on how we will execute the project.
Okay, great. Another one for you. In communicating, what are your thoughts on texting between CRO and sponsor?
So this is a great question. And I mean, as Jamie said, we all have our phones with us all the time. And I think that texting between sponsors and CROs for just, if you are wanting to alert somebody to, hey, I sent you an email, or maybe you're checking in, that's fine. But the trouble with text messages is that those aren't documented. And so anything requiring a decision or any critical communication needs to be within your email communication so that it can be documented and placed in the TMF. I think texting is great for alerts or for quick messaging, but overall it's not something that we would recommend as a primary communication.
Okay, great. What happens when the sponsor is so used to one PM and a new PM is introduced to an existing account? So not interim coverage, but a formal transition. How do we get the sponsor comfortable with the new PM and vice versa?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know I touch on a number of these things, and that's why I really, when I talked about parental leave, we recognize that this may be something that's a forever change. So really starting with the basics, again, going back Being consistent, recognizing, being transparent that this is occurring, that we are transitioning to a new person, identifying what they liked about the previous person, what made that relationship work very well. And it likely was that they identified the communication styles, that they worked well, that they anticipated the needs of the client, and really going from there. Having frequent follow-ups, being consistent, really building that trust one step at a time. Feedback is critical, so asking for that feedback so that if it doesn't meet the client's needs or they still have concerns, figuring out how you can continue to build that relationship. But it's the same type of things. It's really, you have to build it one step at a time.
Sure. Okay, we've got time for, I think, a couple more questions here. What do you do if, even after all of the efforts for relationship building, the relationship is still difficult?
Okay, so if you have a situation where you, I think actually we've had a situation recently, even on one of my projects, where we had sort of a difficult relationship where one of my functional leads was trying to find a path forward with somebody who was actually quite condescending to them and spoke in a very disrespectful way despite trying to establish trust and build rapport. I think this is the critical part of some of those escalation pathways that Jamie discussed. I think that's where some of these come into play, where if you've done your best and you have, kind of talked through with some of your colleagues and team members and tried to, communicate appropriately, and but your counterpart still remains difficult and sort of unwavering, then this would be a time where I would, sort of utilize my escalation pathway to elicit feedback from a different perspective, maybe even internally and externally as well.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in as well. I think that it's important to really use those escalation pathways, even when it's a very positive feedback. So really bolstering the relationship and really encouraging it so that it's not always seen that if I go to the escalation pathway, it's a negative response.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So really using those pathways as they're put in place so that they recognize that we encourage it and that we value that as well.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for one final question here. How do you manage as a CRO a sponsor that micromanages and questions every CRO action?
Okay. I think for me that question would be sort of, we talked about sort of that oversight and how that can feel as almost micromanagement, and sometimes depending on who you're working with. And I think as Jamie and I have talked about, you want to make sure that you kind of understand where this micromanagement is coming from. Depending on the sponsor that you're working for, it may be just that they have more formal practices and policies in place, and that this is how their company culture operates. And so it's not personally directed at you. I've had that, working with smaller to mid-sized pharma versus a sort of larger pharma, where the larger pharma has more policies and procedures in place and more levels of approval that our team has to go through, and that feels like a lot more management of our activities as opposed to some of the smaller to mid-size. I think that, again, as Jamie highlighted, the sponsor is ultimately responsible at the end of the day for the study, and so you just want to make sure that you maybe ask questions about, elicit that feedback. How do you feel things are going? And see if you can kind of come to a place where you understand that maybe the micromanagement is more just driven by their SOPs and processes, or if it is that maybe they had a bad experience before coming to you, and you can discuss different ways for them to get the information that they need, and try to ask those open-ended questions to get to sort of what they need in order to be comfortable.
And I'll chime in as well that it's, goes back to the reporting, as Kristen talked about, that it may be that if you can provide some additional reporting structures on a regular basis, that may satisfy some of that need to micromanage, that may help them have a more visibility. They may be used to doing all the little details that they've now been required to outsource. And so their comfort level with the workload may be different. And so understanding where they're coming from and how they're used to functioning, it may help them as well.
Okay, great. Well, I think that was the last question that we have time for today. We had a lot of really good questions, and we couldn't get to them all, but we will be getting back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. I want to thank everyone for attending this Fierce Live webinar. I also want to thank our speakers for presenting and Ro for presenting today's webinar as well. The webinar has been recorded. You'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours on the same page that you used to register for the event. Again, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Optimizing Sponsor CRO Relationships, presented by Ro. I'm Rebecca Williamson, the publisher of Fierce Markets Life Sciences Group, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Kristen Snipes, Project Director at Ro, and Jamie Arnott, also Project Director at Ro. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. Got just a few technical notes for you before we begin. If you have any trouble reading a slide, please hold and drag the right corner of the slide window to enlarge. Please also disable your pop-up blocker to participate in the interactive parts of the presentation.